Yes. All right, let's begin. We are in the Jewish life cycles class, and we've given birth. We had babies, Baruch Hashem, good healthy babies, boy, girl, doesn't matter. Either way, the baby needs a name. Now, today's class is sponsored anonymously, and I'd also like to dedicate this class, if it's all right, to a refuah shlema for Fega Malka Bat Gittel Chana. Should have a refuah shlema, and along with Kol Chole Yisrael, and we should only hear good news. Hashem can save everybody in a split second, blink of an eye. Amazing miracles can happen, and good people deserve them. That's what I say. Okay. For what it's worth. Okay. The quote from about 500 years ago, a guy by the name of Bill Shakespeare wrote in a play called Romeo and Juliet, "What's in a name? That which we call a rose by any other name would smell just as sweet." Boy, was he wrong, right? He basically was saying that names don't matter. Now, of course, the character, he wasn't saying it, the character was saying it, a character who's in love with a particular person whom she can't marry. So there's a whole fight about it. So she basically says, what's in a name? It doesn't matter what his name is. Doesn't matter if he's a Montague or whatever. Doesn't matter. I can love him anyway. And the answer is, yeah, you're right, but there's a much bigger picture going on. Names do matter, we say. And we'll see, hopefully today, part of the goal is to find out why they matter, how they matter. But also, because this is a Jewish life cycles class, we're going to learn about when we name the child. There's basically there's some customs, some prevailing customs about that, and what we name the child. So there's a lot of customs about that, a lot more than you might think. So I think a good way to start, if you don't mind, and I know it's not the Parsha class, but in this week's Parsha, there is a birth. It's the birth of Yaakov and Asav. So in Bereshit, chapter 25, verse 25, easy to remember, 25, it says, the V'yetza Harishon, the first one came out, Admoni, he was reddish, Kulo ke'aderet se'ar. He was like a hair, he had like a hairy, he was covered in fur almost. V'yikru shemo Asav, and they called him Asav. They called him V'yikru, and they called him. Who's they? Who called him that? So says Rashi, Hakol karu lo kain. Everybody called him that, because that's what you call him. He's Asav. He's Asui. He's complete. He looks like a complete adult, mature male. He's done. He's made. He's been baked in the oven. He's complete. He's Asav. Everybody called him that. So because everybody called him that, that became his name. Next pasuk, Chavav 26. It says, after that, Yatsa Achiv. His brother came out, V'yado ochezet be'akev, and his hand was grasping on to Asav's heel. Ekav Asav, v'yikra shemo, and he called his name Yaakov. Okay, and then it continues to tell us how old Yitzhak was when they were born. He was 60. Okay, anyway, who's he? We said they called him Asav. Everybody around, the whole world saw he was complete, and everybody called him Asav. And then he called his Asav's twin brother Yaakov. Who is he? So Rashi's fascinating because Rashi's famous for what we call Pashut Pshat, the simple explanation. And his simple explanation, he gives two. And his first, his instinctive first response here is who called him V'yikra shemo Yaakov? Hakadosh Baruch Hu. Hashem called him that. Hashem gave him the name of Yaakov. Hashem didn't give Asav the name Asav. They did, the people around. Hashem himself gave Yaakov his name. Why? Atem karitun livchorachem shem. You gave a name to your firstborn. Afani ekra livni b'chori shem. I will also give my firstborn a name. Yaakov, the progenitor of the Jewish people, were considered Hashem's bechorim, Hashem's firstborn. Hashem names him. So name is important.
You think like Yaakov it's like kind of thought like, oh, isn't that odd? Like I have Yaakov's name being told to me and not Asav's.
I don't know if he knew that it was being told to him. Sometimes, as we'll see in this class, people come up with names thinking that they're random, and then they find out later on that they were actually miraculously prophetic. But we'll get to that.
Cool.
Right? So that's why, and actually that's related to what I was about to say, because Rashi's second opinion, Devar Acher, who called him, who's the he who called him that? This, what we would have thought the simple explanation is, Aviv kara lo Yaakov. His father called him Yaakov. Al Shem achizat ha'akev, because he was holding on to the heel. So a person's behavior, a person's character somehow gives us the idea of what the name of the person should be. But there's more to it than that. On a sort of mystical side here, don't want to freak you out too much. There is a book called Mahadmesharim. The Mahadmesharim is a book written by Rav Yosef Karo, who's the author of the Shulchan Aruch, right? Very, very important work. The basically basis of all Jewish law. So he wrote another book called Mahadmesharim. And Mahadmesharim literally means like the messenger, the speaker from the heavens. It's because there's a whole incident. I'm not going to go into the details, but basically he had visitations from an angel on a regular basis, and that angel taught him Divrei Torah, and he compiled them over a course of several years, and basically wrote a book of commentary on the Torah based on what the angels taught him. The angel, I should say, a particular angel taught him these some ideas. So on Parshat Shemot, which is called names, right? So why is it called names? Because there's a Gemara that in the Bavli that discusses a verse in Tehillim 46:9. Tehillim 46:9 says, "L'chucha zu miflaot Hashem." Go and see the amazing Hamifalot Hashem. Sorry, go and see the amazing works of Hashem. Sam shamot ba'aretz. He places destruction on the land. He's so powerful. Hashem is so great, so powerful. He can place destruction. He can destroy a land. It's not usually what we know Hashem for. That's not the greatness of Hashem. Hashem's greatness is that he doesn't destroy. All right. But he can, and he doesn't. The fact the Gemara says, say al tikra shamot, don't call it destruction, ele shemot. The greatness of Hashem is that he places names in the world. Now, we're not going to get into, sometimes the Talmud says, don't read it like this, read it like that instead. That doesn't mean we change the the word. We read it, when we read Tehillim, we read it shamot. Don't get me wrong. But in interpreting it, in trying to understand this verse, one way to understand it, says the Gemara, is to understand how powerful names are. So the Mahadmesharim taught Rav Yosef Karo that this idea that the Talmud says that al tikra shamot el shemot is important because it shows you that parents have, that the name that a person has says something about the person's character. He gives an example. He says if somebody's name is Avraham, then they're very likely to be more generous, like Avraham Avinu was, right? If somebody's like Yosef, the author is Yosef Karo. If somebody's name is Yosef, He might have ability to withstand his Yetzer Hara like Yosef Atzadik did, that sort of thing. So a name can influence the person. Now, by the way, just to get out of the mystical for a moment, that makes a lot of sense psychologically, right? Um, you know, as many of you know, I have one of my daughter's names is Moria, right? So she has a connection. She's never been to Yerushalayim, but she has a connection with Yerushalayim. Moria is the name of the mountain on which the Temple Mount, right, where the Beit Hamikdash was. We named her that because she was born 2 days before Tisha B'Av. So that was sort of the theme that was going on around then. Anyway, other reasons too, but whatever. That was one of the things. So she has an intrinsic connection psychologically to Yerushalayim. She thinks about it all the time. She sees a picture of the Western Wall and she says, jokingly, you know, obviously she knows, hey, they're on top of my head. You know, they look at all these people on top of my head. So that's not mystical at all. That's pure psychology. You teach a person, you name a person a certain thing. That person is now connected to other people who had that name because you know that name. I know, every child, almost every child, learns the story of Avraham. So if a person's name is Avraham and they learn about Avraham or they learn about Sarah and their name is Sarah, they see, oh, I can be generous like Sarah. I can have a tent like Sarah had a tent. I can light candles. I can make challah, right? So that's all of that is normal psychological stuff. There's nothing mystical about that at all, perhaps. But there is also, we say, a sort of mystical side to it, and that is that there is a connection between all the people who have this kind of name. Now, on the subject of giving names, and this is very, very relevant to the class. By the way, I should also say, I thought I had it written down somewhere. I did. I had it written down. I skipped it, and I'm going to say it. I've written down twice because I want to say it in the beginning, and I want to say it at the end. Almost everything we're going to say tonight are customs, not laws. So if I say something and you say, "Hey, that's not how we named our child," don't worry about it. These are customs. You're not. It's not like a direct. You've been cut off from the Jewish people now that you named your child incorrectly. There's no such thing as naming your child incorrectly. In fact, that's one of the points here, is that what a parent names a child should and could have a touch of Ruach HaKodesh, can have a touch of prophecy in it. And before we go too much more into it, I want to also add, only the parents, not the grandparents, not the aunt who just lost her husband, not the this, not the that. It doesn't matter what you have a relative who just had a baby. Be quiet about what you think the name should be. You might have an idea in your head what you think the baby's name should be. Keep it to yourself. Let the parents use their prophecy to figure out the name. It's their prophecy, not yours. That's I can't begin to tell you how many stories I know of people who got into conflicts with people because of this. They basically lost family members because they didn't name it after a particular family member. That's not the point of naming somebody after a family member, as we'll see. And it's certainly none of anybody else's business. It's the parents decide, and whatever they decide goes. That's the name. You can make up a nickname if you want. There's problems with that. We're not going to, maybe we'll talk about that later, but the name is the name, and that's what's in the name. There's an interesting story, a very kind of contemporary story I read recently that I'd like to share with you, just to give you an idea of what it means for parents to have some sort of touch of prophecy. True story. There's a non-religious Israeli guy, and he's friends with a travel agent, and the travel agent knows, I forgot what the date is. I'm not such a big expert on Hasidic Rebbe's yard sites, but there's a Rebbe called Rav Elimelech of Lezhensk. Rav Elimelech of Lezhensk, famous rabbi, wrote a famous book. Anyway, so this Rav Elimelech of Lezhensk has a yard site, and people say that visiting his grave in Poland on his yard site, miracles happen.
I did that.
Oh, it's a famous. Oh, you've been there? I didn't
Yeah,
know.
on his yard site.
Oh, there you go. Oh,
Like our
do you know when the
seminary
yard
went.
site was, by the way, just in case?
We went like in a like right after Purim.
Right after Purim, so right. Okay. All right. So somewhere in Adar. Okay. Any other, maybe beginning of Nisan. I don't know. Anyway, either way, it's a famous segula to go there, and you supposedly your prayers get answered. So this non-Israeli fellow whose friend is this whose friend is the tour agent, travel agent. Thank you. So this Israeli guy has been struggling for a long time to have a child. And this travel agent says, you know what, I'll buy you a ticket to Poland on this yard site. You'll go and you'll pray at the grave. And the travel agent is a religious guy. And he says, on one condition, that you name your child, if it's a boy, you name him Elimelech. There's another condition too, but I'm not get into, don't need all the details of the story. So he says, go ahead, fine. He goes there, he prays, he calls the travel agent a few months later and says, my wife is pregnant. Wife's pregnant. Great, wonderful. They find out it's a boy. Boy's born. They're about to go to the Brit Milah. We'll talk about that later, about when we name the child. And the Brit Milah is about to happen. Oh, sorry. Thank you, Shando. It's the 21st of Adar. All right, is the yard site. Okay, Baruch Hashem. So the other Rishon or Shani, and it doesn't matter. All right. Anyway, for anybody who's planning on traveling this year, the story goes that they're ready. They have the baby, and the guy calls the travel agent and he says, you know what? I'm sorry, I have one problem. My wife, we're secular Israelis, doesn't like the name Elimelech. It's a little too verfrumpt. It's a little too old-fashioned. We want a more modern Israeli name. I don't know. We made a deal. I bought you a ticket. You know, you're having a baby. So the guy's torn. He doesn't know what to do, and he says, you know what? We'll do. We'll give him the name Elimelech as a second name. We'll talk about second names also later in the class. So we'll give him the Elimelech as a second name. My wife has another idea of a first name. So comes the bris, comes the naming ceremony, and they give the name. His name is Noam Elimelech. What's amazing is that is the name of the Sefer of Rav Elimelech of Lezhensk. Because the book he wrote is called Noam Elimelech. Noam Elimelech is what he's known as. He's, outside of Hasidic circles, you don't know who knows Lezhensk, right? So we know him as Noam Elimelech. That was the name of the boy. They had no idea. The parents had no idea that Noam was the name of the book. So anyway, the miraculous stories like that of prophecy happen all the time. I know lots of people whose names fit their character to a T, and who behave almost exactly as their name. And again, maybe some of that is psychological, right? Because like we said, you're taught that that's what your name means, and you try to behave that way because you realize that that's obviously an important thing. Right? Your parents named you that because they want you to act in a certain way, and so you want to behave that way. So that's one thing. The Gemara says, based on a verse in Mishlei, on that subject, this is like sort of on the negative side of that subject. There's a verse in Mishlei that says Shem Rishayim Yirkav, that the names of the wicked should be buried. In other words, it means a couple of things. One of the things that it means is whenever we say the name of a bad person, of a Russia, we should say, we say there's sort of a little curse we say afterwards. We shouldn't broadcast evil people's names and be happy about it. We say, Adolf Hitler, Yimach Shemo. We say words like that, right? We wouldn't want to name a child after that, God forbid. Says Rashi on the Gemara there, that's exactly what it means, Shem Rishayim Yirkav, is that Shema Garam, that the name has an impact on the person, and then therefore we don't want to name anybody the same name as an evil person. So this brings up, for instance, a very popular name in Israel right now is Nimrod, right? Or something like that. Right? Nimrod was a Russia. It was an evil, evil person, almost killed our entire nation by throwing Avraham Avinu into a kivshan ha'esh, into a fiery furnace. So why would you call your child Nimrod is an interesting question. Obviously, he's the Torah calls him a strong man. So you want your child to be big and strong, like a good Greek. I don't know, but whatever the case may be, that kind of name happens. By the way, if anybody's name out there in the Facebook world is, if your name is Nimrod, don't be offended. I didn't come up with the name, or you can be offended. I don't know. So we don't name after evil people. In fact, you could learn this lesson also from the Torah. A lot of people don't know this. In the Torah, interestingly enough, by the way, we talk very often about how people name after other people. We'll talk about that in a few moments, but you don't have a lot of that in the Torah, right? I saw a joke recently. How do you know that Avraham? How do you know that the Avot? How do you know that the Avot were not Sephardic? Right? Because if they were Sephardic, their names would be Avraham, Yitzchak, Avraham. Right? So his name is Yaakov because they don't name after somebody else. Yitzchak could have named after Avraham, but he didn't. Okay, he was still alive, and it's Sephardim do that. So as we'll talk about, there is somebody, however. There are certain names in the Torah that are repeated. Chanoch is a common name in the Torah in different parshiyot. There's a name Chanoch. There's also a name that we don't really think about being common. There's two people in the Torah whose name is the same, and that's Korach. There are two Korachs in the Torah. You didn't know that, huh? Right? So there's the Korach that we know, the son of Yitzhar, one of the Levium who rebelled eventually against Moshe Rabbeinu, and there was also earlier in the Torah, a few parshas from now, one of Asav's sons is named Korach. Writes the Chatam Sofer that it's because his parents named him Korach that he was influenced to be a bad person. It's amazing. I don't know why they named him that. I didn't have a conversation with Korach's parents, Rabbi and Rebbetzin Korach. Why did you name your kids Yitzchar? Why did you name your son Korach? I don't know, but but for whatever reason they did, and his name somehow influenced him to do this bad thing, to rebel against Moshe and almost undermine the entire Torah. It's a big deal. So that's how important it is when you sit down and think about what your baby's name should be. Okay, so when do we name? So I had somebody come up to me last Shabbat to make sure that I emphasize this. Again, it is a custom, not a law. We have customs about when to name children, and the custom for boys is to name them at the Brit Milah. God willing, next week we'll talk a lot more about Brit Milah and the customs of Brit Milah. Hopefully, I'll get an opportunity to bring somebody here that I'm interviewing, a Moel, for some expert advice on the customs of Brit Milah. But aside from that, what if you couldn't? What if the Brit Milah is a long time from now? Can you name your child earlier? And the answer is yes, you can. It's just a custom, and especially in situations like emergency situations where the child's not going to leave the hospital for a few months or whatever, God forbid. In those sorts of situations, you need a name to daven for. You need a name, so you give the child a name, boy or girl, doesn't matter. You give it's important for the child to have a name so people can pray and not just say Tinok, baby, right? Somebody's name is important, as we've been saying, and it's so important. By the way, it's interesting. A lot of people may or may not know this custom, but there's a there's a custom when you say Shemona Esrei at the very, very end of the Shemona Esrei, you're supposed to say a verse. And that verse is supposed to contain the first letter of the verse is supposed to be the first letter of your name. And the last letter of the verse is supposed to be the last letter of your name. So if it's a double name, by the way, most people use the last letter of your second name, right? And the custom is to say that when you're finishing Shemona Esrei. Why? Where did that come from? So that comes from actually the Shlach HaKadosh, the Shnei Luchot HaBrit. So he writes that when people at the end of days, at the end of their day, after 120 years, when they go to Shemayim, they're going to be asked their name. And they're going to be so scared and so in awe and so confused and everything else. All the emotions are going to be so overwhelming that they're just going to shine forgessen. They're going to forget their name. They're going to not know what their name is. And what will you remember in Shemayim? You'll remember Torah. You'll never forget that in Shemayim, you'll remember all the Torah you've ever learned. And that verse is Torah. So you'll remember that verse. And that verse is going to be your ID card to explain who you are. That's your real ID. I don't know what the government's been telling you. That's your real ID. Okay.
Question. Wait, I've been doing two pasukim.
Okay.
God damn, like for my first name and middle name, you're saying it's both? It's just one?
I've never heard of somebody doing both, but yeah, usually people just.
What? Oh my goodness.
I don't know. If you heard that from somebody, it might be try. I'll look it up if it makes you feel better.
But I just assumed.
You know what you should assume? You should assume that the Shlach HaKadosh didn't know about double names.
Oh, wait a minute. Shandel has a shin and the lamed even. My middle name's Rachel.
Okay, so good. So yeah, you're good with the first person. By the way, the psukim that the Torah, the psukim that the Siddur has, Art Scroll or whatever, those psukim are not the only psukim you can use. You can use any old pasuk you want. In fact, I don't know, should I advertise? But my Hebrew name is Nachum. That's one name, pretty easy to remember. And the verse that I've been saying for most of my life never really, I don't know, I shouldn't say this about a pasuk, but it didn't resonate with me. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Obviously, it's a beautiful pasuk, beautiful Karl Bach song, Nachamu Nachamu Ami. It's a beautiful song, but like, what is it like? How does that mean? Like, I can comfort people. Okay, I can do that. But it's it's not. It didn't really like. I didn't really feel it when I was saying it. So I looked up other pasukim that I could say, and I found a beautiful one. It's the last pasuk that we say in benching, Nar ha'isi gam zaganti, right? I was old and I was young, and I never saw tzaddik suffering from hunger. That's I love that pasuk. That's that one, also a beautiful song, and that's the one I say. You can choose any verse you want as long as it follows that rule of having the first letter being the first letter of your name and the last letter in the pasuk being the last letter of your name. It gets complicated when you have like an unusual name. Who was it? I think my son had a classmate whose name started with an ayin and ended with a samach, I think, something like that. And I don't know if this person ever found a verse that works like that. But anyway, it was that happens too. I'm sure. Maybe they found a pasuk. I don't know. But either or you could also, there's other things you could do. You could find any other maybe another word that's in the verse. There's other ways to do it besides that. But the point is to have a pasuk, to have a verse. Because let's back up a second. Why does the Shlah say that? Why are they going to ask you your name? You're in heaven. Don't they know it already? Right? This isn't TSA. Why do they need you? Why do they need your name? So they need your name because your name speaks you. Your name is you. You're saying they're judging you based on who you are, right? You're not being judged on somebody else's standard. There's only one standard they're looking at when they judge you in Shemayim, and that standard is how did you behave based on who you are and what your potential was. Your potential is completely in your name somehow. Okay. With that said, let's go on. So we've got so the custom, like I said, is for boys to be named at their Brit Milah, but if not, if for whatever reason, there's nothing wrong with naming a boy at some other time. And again, the custom is just like with a girl, which we haven't discussed yet. When the girl is born, the custom is to give the name as soon as possible at the earliest possible aliyah to the Torah. The father gets an aliyah to the Torah, and the child gets the name. There's a special prayer to say. There's actually, according to Rav Moshe Feinstein, 2 special prayers to say. Do you know that? One is to give the name and give the blessing, et cetera, et cetera. And the second one is that the mother should have an easy recovery. A lot of people put the 2 together, and it's one big bracha, one big mishaberach. And I guess there's nothing wrong with that, but it should be 2 separate things. There's 2 separate blessings. One should be for the child, that should grow up in the Torah, mitzvah, et cetera, et cetera. And the other one should be that the mother and the baby should have a refuah shlema. They should recover. It was an ordeal. I'm speaking passively about it. The name, obviously many different customs developed about what the name should be. So that's the idea about when to name the baby. Any questions about when to name the baby, about the aliyah? A lot of people wait for the next Shabbat. There's more people who are going to see the name. Oh, no, that's not correct. The best thing to do is to go the next possible opportunity to hear the Torah. If the baby's born midnight Monday, 6 o'clock in the morning, be at shul. So if you can, obviously, to give the name. By the way, also, there are situations where the father can't go to shul. Let's say, lately we've had COVID. People haven't been able to go to shul for whatever reason. Previous to that, if somebody's traveling, right, the father could be, God forbid, in war or whatever, or maybe there also, God forbid, there might not be a father. He might have succumbed to battle or illness, et cetera, et cetera. So the baby doesn't have a name then, right? I guess we don't need a name, right? Of course we need a name, but that's what we're talking about here. So the baby gets a name, and usually the somebody from the family, a brother, a sister, not a sister, a brother, a cousin, a father, somebody gets an aliyah, and the baby is given a name. I'm not going to tell my the niece the nephew joke, but it's a good one. If you know, you know. So that's when to give the baby the name. And again, these are customs. And again, if there's any unusual circumstances, there's a lot of halachic reasons not to push this. And again, also important, it's only the parents' responsibility to give the name, and if they can't, that's another story. But the relatives do not need to butt in with their opinions about what the name should be. Okay, we've said that before, and I like to emphasize stuff like that. Names. What kind of names? So we've already talked about how we have the custom is not the custom. The law is not to name after evil people. Okay, that makes sense. But also, we need to have at least a little bit of a discussion about Yiddish numen, about Jewish names. What are Jewish names, and do we have to stick to them and stuff like that? There's a midrash that tells us that the Jewish people were rescued from Egypt in the merit of lo shinu et shamam. They did not change their names. So on the simple explanation, what that means is they kept Hebrew names. They didn't have Egyptian names. They didn't have, Aramaic names. They had good Jewish names. And for that reason, some halachic authorities, the Khatam Sofer's Rebbe, the Maharam Shik, for instance, wrote that it's not proper to use Gentile names. it's it's inappropriate. It's not a Jewish thing to do, etc., etc. In fact, little tidbit, he's called Maharam Shik. Shik is his last name. It's a strange last name, right? It's actually an acronym because he lived in a time when in Europe, when people had to pick last names, they usually had to pay for them, and they had to pay usually based on what city they were from. So Volozhin, if they come from Volozhin, their last name was Volozhiner. If they're, if they come from, if they're a farmer, if they're a tailor, their last name had to do with that. Shik was his last name because it's an acronym for Shem Yisrael Kodesh. The name of a Jew is holy. That's the name he chose for himself for his last name, because he didn't want to be named after the city he was in, or what profession he was in, based on like the German word for it, or the Prussian word for it, or whatever it is, whatever language they were speaking where he lived. So he wanted a holy Jewish name. He said Shem Yisrael Kodesh. That's what Shik stands for. Maharam Shik. So he held very strongly, and that is a popular halachic opinion, by the way, is that you should only have Jewish names, Hebrew names, biblical names. We'll talk about that in a moment in more detail, God willing, soon. But he's not alone. There are other halachic authorities, and they were asked, like Rav Moshe Feinstein, Igrod Moshe, was asked, is it okay to have a secular name? Robert, or John, or I don't know. So some John happens to be, huh? Benji?
Name Benji.
Okay.
Not
Benji.
Not that I'm
Yeah, so or okay, fine. Let's ask that question. What about Jewish names that were Americanized or secularized, right? Abraham, right? Is that okay? Is it equal to the holy name of Avraham, right? So Abraham, right? So that sort of thing. So Rav Moshe points out, amongst other things, it's a long teshuva, but one of the things he points out that's very, very important is look back at history. Look back at history. Does everybody have only Jewish names? Does everybody have only Hebrew names in our past? So look at the Rambam. All right, it's a good place to start when we talk about halacha. Look at the Rambam. Rambam is Rav Moshe ben Maimon. His father's name itself is a good, strong Arabic name, right? Maimon, or Assyrian, or I don't know what it is, but it's definitely not Hebrew, Maimon, and nobody seemed to say anything about it. Nobody criticized it. Rambam didn't write anything about how your name has to be Hebrew. So amongst other reasons, it's very clear from Rav Moshe that it's perfectly okay to have non-Jewish names, unless you're choosing that non-Jewish name for non-Jewish reasons. In other words, God forbid, a Jew living in America wants so badly to not be Jewish, wants so badly to intermarry and lose all Jewish identity, that they name their child Christopher, or something clearly Gentile-ish. I don't know if that's a word, but Gentile-esque, right? So a very definitely not, clearly not Jewish name for purposes of non-Jewish reasons. So that is where Reb Moshe would agree with the Maharam Shik and say that that's inappropriate, that's incorrect, right? Names like even Akiva, right? Look at the name Akiva in the Talmud, right? It's an Aramaic name. There's discussion like maybe it's somehow related to the Hebrew word Yaakov, whatever. I don't know, but either way, it's definitely not Hebrew, and it might not actually be related to anything of a Jewish nature, and perhaps it might have something to do with the fact that he wasn't really raised religious, right? Rabbi Akiva became religious when he was 40, right? So he was about teshuva. So until that time, he seems to have not been raised Jewish, or Jewish-esque. So Um, and also he points out that perhaps also this concept of lo shinu et shemam, that they didn't change their names, so it says Rav Moshe, only applied before Matan Torah. So before Matan Torah, before the Torah was given, how do you be Jewish? How can you maintain Judaism? One way is to keep a name. Now that there's a Torah, you can be Jewish by learning Torah. You have the Torah that connects you to Judaism no matter what your name is. Your name could be Christopher, and you could still be a rabbi. I don't know any. There might be Christopher's name there. I don't know. It doesn't matter. The point is that your name is not what connects you to Judaism alone anymore. That used to be the case before the Torah was given. There was sort of like a cultural attachment to Judaism. We have more than that now. We have the Torah, which makes Judaism so much stronger than just matzah balls and funny Yiddish names. All right. So that's one thing. Another thing to talk about, and this is a big discussion. We could probably have a whole class on this alone, is who to name the child after. Right? So again, nobody's business except the parents, but let's talk to the parents here for a moment, or future parents. Who are you gonna name your children after? So the custom is, as you know, the prevailing custom, especially in the Ashkenazi world, is to name after relatives or ancestors. By the way, has no connection with the Holocaust. I just want to point that out. Right? A lot of people think, oh, I don't really have any relatives to name after. I have relatives to name after, but they didn't die in the Holocaust, so that has nothing to do with anything. The Holocaust is not the reason to name people what we name them. In fact, there's kind of a discussion, which is worth discussing, about whether you should name people after people who died young. Right? It's a sad fact that the Nazis, Yimach Shemam, and those who helped them, Yimach Shemam as well, they killed people regardless of age. And if your grandmother had a sister or a brother who was killed young, God forbid, then naming the child after that person is at least a question. Doesn't mean you don't do it. There are people do it. You want to remember the memory of the person. You want, maybe that person's name has some other connection to the family. We'll discuss that in just a moment. But the prevailing custom is to name after relatives, especially in Ashkenazic circles, after relatives who passed away. In Sephardic circles, as mentioned earlier in the joke, the custom is to name after relatives who are still alive. There's even the concept of junior in some parts of the Sephardic world, right? Avraham ben Avraham or something like that, right? That happens. Nothing wrong with that. So why do we do that? So there are a number of reasons. I'll give you three. And we've basically discussed all of these reasons in one way or another in the last 45 minutes already. But just to put it out there, one reason is to maintain yichus. In other words, to have some sort of family attachment. Whose family are you? Oh, you're the the Abraham Schwartz family. Oh, there's a lot of Abraham Schwartzes. Oh, yes, but we're related to that family. So whatever it is, right? So that's a connection to the family forever. It's a yichus. It's like which Schwartz are you? Oh, the Abraham Schwartz. Okay, got it. Not the other Schwartz. Got it. All right, so that's one way. That's sort of like very practical reason to keep a name going. Another reason is obviously to give kavod, to give respect, to give honor to a particular person. Now we've already discussed what if that person wasn't so what if that person wasn't the greatest person? What if that person wasn't charitable, wasn't nice, was kind of a humdrum, mean old codger, right? So do you want to name your child after such a person? So there's discussion about that, and obviously, again, parents have the final say. but and if they don't want to name after the person, obviously they have no obligation to, because there's a lot of names to choose from outside of the family. And also, we should we'll get to that in a moment. So giving kavod is one of the reasons. We want to give honor, we want to give respect. That's one of the reasons why Sephardim name after somebody who's still alive, is to give them kavod in their life. You see, we respect you so much, we're naming our child after you, right? So what's the point of doing it after the person has passed? Yeah. And the third reason, and this is the one we've already discussed, is the spiritual aspect. We want the child to have the spiritual attributes of that other person. We had this awesome uncle Reuven, and we want this child to have the same name because we want him to be just like that awesome person who unfortunately passed. Right? So that's the idea, and it's either entirely spiritual, or like I said before, there's a sort of, as most spiritual things, as we learned in our previous Kabbalah class, as with most spiritual things, there's a sort of psychological component too, right? Like, oh, so tell me more about this uncle I'm named after. Oh, he was nice. Okay, I guess that's important, isn't it? So that's that's sort of the mindset of naming somebody after somebody who passed. We discussed about if the person died young, there are customs not to name after somebody who died young. There's discussion about how do you name the person after that person? So in other words, what is that person's name, and can you name your child after that person but sort of change the name? So a lot of people, especially in America, seems like they have a relative whose name starts with say, give me a letter. Any letter. Dalet, D. All right. They have a relative whose name is Don. Okay. Common enough name, Donald, Don. And they want to, and now they're having a child, boy. They want to name the child Don, something also starts with a D. So they're going to name him Daniel or Don or something like that, or Daryavish, probably not. Anyway, so whatever it is, whatever the name might be, they use like the first letter of the name to give to carry on that name. That's one way to do it. That's a common enough custom. Another way, something we did, especially with one of our children, is to use the characteristic of the person, and to use the characteristic as part of the name. I might as well say, yeah. So like Amalia, in the speech I gave at her baby naming, another custom, right? So I mentioned that Amal means work. It's hard work, and she was born a little over a year after my father passed, and we didn't want to call her Gennady, right? That's my father's Russian name. But we didn't want to call her Gershon or Gershona or whatever, or some feminized version of Gershon. So we wanted to name her after a characteristic of my father. He was a hard worker. So we wanted her to have that characteristic of working hard, or of fighting through challenges. So that's why we named her what we did. Also, we had this other shtick, as you know, about the last letters of our children's names, but that's aside to the point. And that is, by the way, there's no halakhic basis for that. It's just completely, like I said, shtick, just a cool thing to do. And maybe it might have something to do with the yichus, but we're not going to get into that. All right. Anyway, Chazon Ish was asked halakhic question. Chazon Ish was asked, and we're going to get into his nephew got an interesting question as well. And that's probably how we'll conclude tonight. The question was, is it better to name a child after the parsha in which he or she is born, or is it better to name the child after a deceased relative, like we've been saying? So, in other words, should we connect the child to the Torah portion of the week, right? So, let's say the child is born this week, Toldot. We name the child Yaakov or girl Yaakova or whatever happens. Definitely don't name the child Asav, by the way. We've discussed that already. I don't care how hairy the child is. So, what was that? Do you know somebody named Asav? You probably would. You know everybody. The Chazon Ish said it's better to name after the parsha or the situation that's going on. So, for example, if it's Purim time, so to name the child the Mordechai or Esther is better than naming after a relative. That's the Chazon Ish's opinion. Not everybody agrees, but that was his opinion. It's better to attach the child to Torah than to some relative for all the reasons, even though we've given so many reasons for why there is a legitimate ancient custom to name after relatives. By the way, not so ancient, right? Keep that in mind, right? The Rambam's son's name was not Maimon. The Rambam's son's name is Avraham, right? So there's we name after people in Tanakh. We name especially people who are good, obviously good people in Tanakh. We name people after the parsha of the week. We name people after what's going on or the situation, or if a particular miracle might have happened. Whatever binds the child to, again, what one of the points of all this is to be mechanech the child, to inspire the child to live a life of goodness and good behavior and closeness to Hashem. And for that to happen, obviously, we give a name that's going to be somewhat inspirational. So the Chazon Ish anyway would say that it's better to name a child after whatever's going on. Maybe it's a holiday. So to name a daughter who's born in Shavuot, to name her Ruth, right? Or Yehudis or yeah, Naomi. Yeah, a lot of good names. Somebody born on Tisha B'Av gets the name Menachem very often, or Nechama. It's totally valid custom. Nothing wrong with that. On that subject, the Gadol Hador of Chaim Kanievsky, Shlita, has a very, very controversial opinion. And that is, this is going to be a little funny because this is my wife's name. He's famous for not liking the name Shira. Shira. Why? Because it's not a name in Tanakh. It's not a name. It's a made-up name. He didn't like made-up names. If it's a name in Tanakh, if it's a name that our ancients have had, that's great. But names that are made up, he was not very fond of. Happens to be just between you and me and whoever else is listening to this video. Rav Chaim Fassman, Zecher Tzarech Levracha. So when he found out that we were naming our children, mostly names in Tanakh, and then Amalia came up, and that's not a name in Tanakh. So he said that's not a name in Tanakh. And then his wife kind of looked over at him and said, "That's my sister's name, Rebbetzin Jacobowitz, right? Was the chief rabbi of England's wife, Rabbi Emanuel Jacobowitz's wife, Lady J. So she was also Amalia. So anyway, but so made up names or not, and by the way, he didn't only say that about. He didn't only say that about Shira. He said that also about Gila, Rina, Ditza, Chedva, all the names that aren't actual names in Tanakh. They're just beautiful Hebrew words. Rav Chaim Kanievsky has published that he's opposed to people naming their children that. Yiddish names, would also be a problem. Yeah. It's interesting. I find it fascinating. I wonder what if I had a chance to ask him a question. The first question, one of the questions I would ask him is, what about the name Chaim? His name. It's also not a name in Tanakh. That seems to be okay. I mean, there's Chaya, Chava, right? There's no Chaim. That's not a name in Tanakh. So anyway, I wonder what he would say about that. But again, he wrote quite strongly about that. He's not a fan of made up names. The joke that was going around last year was that they were going to change the name of Shabbat Shira to Shabbat Sarah. Right? It's a joke. Don't take it too seriously. All right. Anyway, so that's that. We're eventually, God willing, we're eventually going to have a class. I hope my plan is in February sometime. We're going to have an entire class dedicated to stories about Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky. That's a famous rabbi. Many of you might have heard of him, but you don't know too many stories about him. The reason I want to have a whole class about him is because he's very inspirational to me, and I think I know a few stories that might have been missed in his biography in Art Scroll. And one of the interesting things I read about him is he had a very interesting opinion about double names. Now, again, this is not to say there shouldn't be any double names, but he particularly was opposed to them, and not for the regular reasons that you might think. There are halachic reasons to be opposed to double names, by the way. One of the biggest halachic reasons to be opposed to double names is what's the name? Sometimes you need, for legal reasons, you need to know what the actual name is. And if somebody has a double name, but they don't go by the first name, they don't go by the second name, they go by some sort of like mixture of the two, some sort of like some sort of nickname or whatever. By the way, on the subject of nicknames, the Gemara says one of the rabbis was once asked how he was zocha, how he merited to live a long life, and he said by never giving anybody a nickname. It's very important not to give nicknames. That's on the subject of names, and take it for what it's worth. Maybe that's before the Gemara was written. I don't know. Anyway, the Rabbi Yaakov said there's another reason why not to use double names, and that is for a halachic reason. Also, what's the name that's going to be in the ketubah? Some people don't even know how to spell their name, their second name. It's some Yiddish name. They don't know how to spell it. I know I'm on the Young Israel WhatsApp group where they ask each other questions sometimes. One of the questions that they asked recently was like, not recently, very, very often, how do you spell this name? How do you spell that name? Is it an ayin? Is it an aleph? Is it there are some interesting names in Yiddish, and you have to know how to spell it correctly for after 120 years, the stone, or for the ketubah when they're married, all of that. But another reason Rav Yaakov was against these double names is because it's they can they end up becoming not well known, and people don't really accept their own identity. Your name is your identity. You only have one name. As John Proctor says at the end of the Crucible, I'm giving away the ending here. I only have one name. I will not have another in my life. Right. So so that's that's the end result. We started with Shakespeare. We ended with Arthur Miller. But either way, the point is that names are important, and how and when and what we name our children has a great influence on their life and on their future. And to quote Indiana Jones 3, choose wisely. All right, so I'm going to stop the recording.